Welcome to my developmental history project. At age 1, none of the theories really apply to me as I was just born. However, I can apply Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At 1 to 2 years old, I really only required psychological needs and I was blessed with food, shelter, and water. I can also apply John Piaget's theory of cognitive development since I was in the sensory motor stage. I was only able to understand the world and my surroundings through my basic senses. As you can see in the photos, I don't really understand what is going around me, but I still have wonder for my surroundings along with my twin sister Ada. Ages 2 through 7. A lot of theories are able to be applied to my development between the ages of 2 to 7. These are the ages where I'm able to remember specific things that happened during my life. I lived in Georgia from ages 1 to 5 and then moved to Evansville, so I experienced from an early age what it is like to move. I was in preschool for 2 years, and then when I moved, I started elementary school. At age 2, I entered the pre-operational stage of Piaget's theory of cognitive development. I was able to start to learn the English language, but struggled with the ability of conversation still. With the hierarchy of needs, I started to feel the need for safety and shelter, and once I got to elementary school, my social needs had early development. Bloom's taxonomy came into play during my early years in elementary school as I wasn't being asked to do anything incredibly complex. I was mainly just being asked to remember concepts such as addition and subtraction. At this age, I am able to apply Kohlberg's theory of moral development, specifically the stage of pre-conventional morality. In the early years of my life, I was super focused on what I could gain from situations and punishments of situations. My parents used time out a lot, so I knew that if something I was going to do was going to result in me getting put in time out, then I would refrain from it. On the flip side, my dad loved to reward us with candy, so I knew if I was good, I would get something like Mike and Ike's out of it. At these early ages, I was only seeing books as mirrors, since the books I was reading were not entirely complex. In elementary school, I had teachers that presented ideas that represented critical pedagogy. A big way that teachers used this in almost every classroom was putting us in grouped tables as opposed to line tables, because this promotes collaboration, which is something I'm absolutely going to want to do as an educator. Also at these ages, my microsystem was starting to develop because I was making friends and forming relationships with my parents and my teachers. Everything that I was learned during these ages would fall under the two outer circles of the zone of proximal development. Early on, I would struggle with concepts even if I had guidance, but as I got older, it became easier to understand. It became easier to complete tasks as long as I had a helping hand. Finally, at these ages, I'm getting introduced to the lower levels of the spiral curriculum with easy to understand concepts. Everything I read and all of the math that I did was super surface level and easy to understand. Ages 8 to 11. Once again, most of the theories can be applied to my life during these ages. These were grades 3rd through 6th, so I remember a lot that happened during this time period and specific things that I was taught. At these ages, I entered the concrete operational stage of cognitive development, so I was able to develop logical reasoning but still struggled with the ability to think abstractly. At this point in my life, I was really starting to make friends and experience a social life, which amplified my social needs and the need for belonging and inclusion. I specifically remember in 5th grade, I was worried I would not have any friends in my classes, but quickly became friends with many people I wasn't friends with before, which gave me a huge sense of belonging. I also took part in the school play The Lion King Jr., which gave me so many new friends. At this age, I entered the conventional morality stage of development, so I wanted to follow rules in order to gain approval of others. I remember specifically trying to follow certain rules so I could win over my teachers and get them to like me. As for Bloom's taxonomy, going through the rest of elementary school, I was introduced to assignments that required me to apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. I did an assignment in 5th grade where I had to read a book and do 9 assignments based on the book. Some assignments were summary-based, while others asked me to create entirely original work based on the book. At these ages, based on the zone of proximal development, it is getting easier to complete assignments on my own, but there will still occasionally be assignments that I would need help with. I know in 6th grade I struggled a lot with math, but could complete assignments regularly if I had someone to ask questions to. But in other subjects such as ELA and social studies, I would do a lot of work by myself because I understood those concepts. In 6th grade, I had one teacher that I felt perfectly exemplified culturally relevant pedagogy. She went out of her way every day to make sure each student's needs were met and that they were happy and able to properly learn. One day, we were all emotional because we didn't do well on a math test that we felt we were being cheated on, and she gave us all a hug and made that class easier. I want to apply this when I'm a teacher. I want to go out of my way to show that I care about every student's needs and backgrounds and then base the lesson around those needs. In this grade, I was starting to read more books that served as windows. A lot of books we read showed different people's lives and how they compared to my own. In these ages, I moved further along the spiral curriculum as concepts we were introduced to naturally built off of one another. Finally, in these ages, I'm getting introduced to what would be a part of my mess-up system. I remember my parents coming into classes to meet with my teachers and my parents forming relationships with my friends. Ages 12 plus. At age 12 and beyond, every single theory is able to be applied to my life, and I can focus on the theories that I will implement when I am an educator. I remember the most from these years of my life as it was when I was in middle school and high school. I changed and grew so much as a person during these years, and so much happened in my life that can't even be listed in this one presentation. The upper two levels of the hierarchy of needs took full force. I cared a lot about how others saw me in middle school, and I wanted recognition from both my peers and my teachers. But once I got to high school, each year I would focus on personal growth and would try to better myself in areas of my life. A big example is how I would try to get better as cross country every year that I did it, which culminated in my senior year where I was running about 55 miles a week and was the best I had ever been. Another example of this is when I was finally old enough to be a camp counselor. Every summer throughout my life since I was 7, I was a camper at the summer camp we went to, but once I graduated high school, I was old enough to be a counselor, which was so fulfilling and allowed me to give the same positive experience I know I had at camp to other kids. This is the same reason that I want to be an educator. At age 12 and beyond, I finally reached the formal operational stage of development. Almost all of the big projects or assignments I was given asked me to abstractly contemplate hypothetical situations. Also at these ages, I entered post-conventional morality. I started to care about human rights and had my own political stances and cared a lot about doing the right thing. I wanted to help others and didn't tolerate when people were mean to others. Every single grade from 7 to 12 was utilizing every stage of Bloom's taxonomy across almost every subject. Typically, we would start each concept with just remembering, but by the end of almost every unit, we were asked to create something original based off of everything we learned from the unit, especially senior year, and this ties directly into the zone of profitable development because so much of what we were asked to do was to be done independently. And while we were able to go to teachers for help, they still expected us to figure things out on our own. When I'm an educator, I will want to be a teacher that helps students but also holds them to high standards and hopes that they can complete tasks on their own. Also in these grades, every subject utilized the spiral curriculum but in full force. For example, math units were divided into day-by-day lessons that built off of what we learned the day before. So we would slowly work up the spiral until we had a full understanding of the unit. As a history teacher, I will have a similar approach and stack each concept on top of one another that was learned before so many students can understand the unit to the best of their ability. In high school, I started to understand and develop my exosystem, macrosystem, and chronosystem, especially the chronosystem, as in 8th grade our world got shut down due to COVID-19 and I missed the last 3 months of middle school. And when we came back for high school, I had to spend the first 2 years wearing a mask every single day. This completely shifted how school was and how we could interact with our peers. Also in high school, I had teachers that presented ideas that represented critical pedagogy. In my senior year language arts classes, we specifically focused on topics that tackle concepts such as racism, inequality, which I'm also going to try to do as an educator. That is my developmental history project. Thank you so much for watching and listening.